Professor Namyong Lee's commentary, long, Diagnosing the Legislative, Judicial and Administrative Record of the Lee Jae-myung government through the lens of the Constitution. The Constitution asks one question: has the path of accountability been widened or narrowed? Policies can change from one administration to the next, but the constitutional frame must not. The Constitution does not rest on the assumption that those in power will act with good intentions. It rests on structures designed to restrain power's instinct for self-preservation. Separation of powers, equality before the law, due process, judicial independence, and freedom of expression are not ornaments. They are the state's survival mechanisms. A 6-month assessment of the Lee Jae-myung government is not about whether it did well or did poorly. It is about whether the constitutional roots for holding power to account have remained intact, or whether the legislature, judiciary and executive have moved in the same direction at the same time to narrow those roots. When accountability narrows, public trust collapses, and that collapse immediately spreads to national security and the economy. Korea is an open economy, highly sensitive to foreign exchange, interest rates and capital flows. When the rule of law and confidence in the justice system wobble, a national risk premium is added. That premium is then passed to ordinary citizens through a weaker won, higher borrowing costs, inflation and reduced employment. That is why constitutional damage cannot be dismissed as a mere political issue or reduced to a mere economic issue. 6 months of legislation. The moment exceptions are hardened into law, the Constitution breaks. The most symbolic development has been a legislative attempt aimed at stopping ongoing criminal trials once a person becomes president. This is not an interpretive debate. It is an attempt to change the rule itself and institutionalize an exception, which makes its destructive power far greater. Article 84 of the Constitution is an exception clause limiting criminal prosecution. In a rule of law state, exceptions must be interpreted narrowly. If the exception is expanded to include suspension of trial, then the equality principle in Article 11 loses its substance. A system in which procedures halt the instant someone becomes the most powerful office holder is a status privilege that no ordinary citizen is ever allowed to possess. A claim of governing stability cannot justify stopping procedure. The proportionality principle in Article 37(2) looks not at the beauty of the objective but at the necessity and restraint of the means. When less intrusive measures exist, such as flexible scheduling of hearings or adjustments to appearance methods, stopping the trial itself is not minimal infringement. On this point, the legislative report card reads not reform, but expansion of exceptions. 6 months of the judiciary. There was a day when Article 84 operated as a real-world suspension of trial. The Seoul High Court postponed a hearing in President Lee Jae-myung's election law remand case by designating the date to be determined later, and the procedure effectively stopped. This was not commentary, it was an event in the legal process itself. The core point is simple. The status of sitting president produced a time advantage. In criminal procedure, time is not neutral. Time dilutes evidence, changes incentives and attitudes among interested parties, relaxes social scrutiny, and ultimately reshapes the conditions under which truth-finding occurs. The moment such an advantage is allocated by status, equality before the law becomes hollow. The judiciary is the last line of defense in a democracy. The moment the courts accept a broader exception, the legislature becomes bolder and the executive draws closer. The public's anxiety is not about who wins, it is about whether the Constitution's door of accountability is being closed. 6 months of administration. Foreign exchange instability must be examined from the cause, not only the response. As the won weakened in the second half of the year, the central bank announced measures to expand dollar liquidity, and the government and regulators repeatedly took steps to stabilize the FX market. The repetition of stabilization measures itself is a signal of elevated national risk. Exchange rates do not move only on trade numbers. When confidence weakens that the country's rules will not be shaken, capital demands a larger safety margin. Capital outflows accelerate, and FX volatility rises. In crises, markets price constitutional stability and the rule of law before they price political slogans. The executive's responsibility is not in response measures. Response is technique that comes after the fact. The executive's true responsibility lies in institutional operation that does not create instability in the first place. When predictability in investigation, trial, media, and regulation wobbles, that instability is instantly converted into exchange rates and interest rates, and it enters the shopping basket of ordinary citizens. The collapse of trust is not emotion. It is an indicator, and the indicators are already warning. Korea is not a country with exceptionally high trust in government or the judiciary. When exceptions expand on top of an already low trust base, the system can shake violently even under small shocks. When signals repeat that the rule of law is wavering, alliances and investors also turn conservative. Sovereign and corporate spreads widen, banks tighten credit, firms shift from investment to cash hoarding, and ordinary citizens are hit by high interest rates, high inflation, and a weak currency all at once. That is the pathway by which a constitutional problem becomes a livelihood problem. A surging USD KRW is not merely an economic phenomenon. It is an instant reaction to national reputation. The exchange rate has swung sharply over a short period. The widening gap between peaks and troughs itself means the risk premium has increased. When the exchange rate rises, the first blow lands on living costs. Energy, raw materials, and food input costs rise, firms consider passing costs through, and consumer prices climb. At the same time, room for interest rate cuts narrows. When a weak currency and high rates overlap, the first rupture occurs in household interest burdens. In this situation, what the state must do is not to fight the market with words, but to restore rules the market can trust. The FX market ultimately prices legal stability and institutional consistency. When the legislature, judiciary, and executive expand exceptions together, the exchange rate reacts faster than any policy declaration. A triple bomb of sovereign, corporate, and household debt opens a pathway to a second IMF-style crisis. Korea's household debt, measured as a share of GDP, is known to be among the highest in the world. When households are trapped in leverage, an FX rate shock and a rate shock translate immediately into shrinking consumption, and domestic demand cools sharply. Corporate debt is not light either. When firms are highly leveraged and the exchange rate jumps, foreign currency funding costs rise. When rates stay high, interest costs surge. Investment and employment then fall together. Sovereign debt is not only about the absolute number, it is about the speed of increase and the credibility that stands behind it. If debt rises rapidly, while confidence in legal and institutional stability wobbles, markets begin to doubt not only repayment capacity, but governing capacity. A second IMF-style crisis is not just FX. It is a compound crisis driven by trust collapse and debt structure. The 1997 IMF crisis was not only about reserves. It exploded when short-term external debt, financial sector fragility, corporate distress, and policy credibility collapsed together. Today's Korea must focus on whether, under rising volatility, a fall in trust causes the debt structure to amplify shocks. The crisis pathway is clear. As trust in judicial process and constitutional procedure falls, a risk premium is added. One weakness accelerates, inflation rises, rate cuts are constrained, interest burdens on households and firms grow, delinquencies and failures increase, financial institutions tighten credit, the real economy turns down. The government then attempts to hold the line with fiscal spending, but as fiscal burdens rise, trust is tested again. Therefore, talk of a second IMF-style crisis is not fear-mongering, it is a structural warning. It is the economic mechanism that emerges when the constitutional order is shaken. When constitutional checks weaken, markets impose penalties through exchange rates and interest rates, and a high debt structure magnifies those penalties into the pain of ordinary citizens. The conclusion of 6 months of misrule is a trust cost created by expanded exceptions. The legislature revealed a direction of institutionalizing status privilege through the notion of suspending a president's criminal trial. The judiciary produced a real event in which an exception entered the procedural track. The executive responded after volatility surged, but failed to first repair the institutional environment that generates instability. The prescriptions are not complicated. First, Article 84 must be interpreted narrowly, and any attempt to legislate trial suspension must be abandoned. Second, reforms to the investigation prosecution architecture and to the judiciary must first prove independence that operates all the way to the end, even in cases involving those in power. Third, freedom of expression and the independence of regulatory bodies must be designed so that criticism remains possible even when power changes hands. The conclusion for the public is also simple. When trust falls, the one shakes first. When the one shakes, the livelihoods of ordinary citizens shake first. The moment constitutional checks are weakened, a second IMF-style crisis arrives not as a line in a statistics table, but as everyday hardship. Citizens, our people must awaken for our country to survive. Thank you for watching Professor Namyong Lee's commentary, Long,